Can we now hear from Giles Parkinson about Electrify in Australia, the future trends for EVs in Australia? Giles is the founder and editor-in-chief of Renew Economy and the founder and editor of his EV, or the EV-focused sister site, The Driven, which I know some people here read all the time. He's the co-host of the weekly Energy Insiders podcast and has been a journalist for over 40 years, part of that as the former deputy editor of the Australian Financial Review. So over to you, Giles.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you very much to the people from Zero Emissions Noosa for inviting us here. Thanks also to RACV Resort for putting us up and it's lovely accommodation. And thanks everyone for being here and listening. Just want to pay my respects to the people of the First Nations and their leaders past, present and future as well, on whose grounds we meet here this evening. I've just got a bunch of slides to show you, because that's the way I do things, and I thought I'd just sort of start off with, for those who don't know, this is the website, The Driven. We publish daily, put out a newsletter daily. It's free to access. And this is our lead story from Thursday, which is about Hyundai and finally the push into vehicle to grid, which I think a lot of people are thinking about. Those of you who don't have EVs might be waiting until you see vehicle to grid, basically having sort of batteries on wheels before you actually make that decision. Can I just actually ask how many people here have EVs already? Okay. How many people, for those who don't, how many people are thinking about it? Fantastic. And how many people just don't want one at all? There you go. You can
He only rides a bike.
Yeah. That's fair enough. Okay. This is it's not my graph. This is the little guy at the bottom of that picture. There is a guy called Michael Liebrich. He founded Bloomberg New Energy Finance about sort of 20 years ago. Fantastic organisation, sort of trend into green energy, and he's now a very rich and wealthy man, and also a very, very good speaker. And he presents a lot of sort of interesting facts about them. This is the Nissan Leaf. This was the first mass market EV in the world. And it's just really interesting to see that on the left is the one that came out in 2010, and on the right is the one that's available now. And what you see there is at that time, the price has fallen by a third, the power has increased twofold, the battery's increased threefold, the charging rate has increased threefold, the range has increased fourfold, and that's just the scale of the progress. And that's just from Nissan, and Nissan hadn't even bothered making another EV apart from that one. Well, they did actually make another one, but I drove it once and it wasn't very good. But they're just starting now to come out and start to roll out a few more EVs because they've kind of realised that the world is actually changing, and Japanese car makers that once ruled the world are about to not rule the world anymore because the Chinese car makers, in particular the EV makers, are overtaking them. So where are we at in Australia? Now look, this is the graph. I hope you can all see that. The line I want you to look at is the green line, and it's just shot up in the last couple of months, and we can thank Donald Trump for that. His brilliant decision to go and invade Iran, and despite all the warnings that the Strait of Hormuz might be closed, and that sent up all the diesel and all the fossil fuel prices. And as Dean will discuss later on, people have been knocking on his door ever since trying to buy an EV. And so we went from about 10%, and we're just kind of sort of bumping along the bottom there, and we just shot up to 20% in the month of May. And we're probably going to stay close to that for a while longer, I reckon. I'm not too sure whether you believe that the issue is resolved yet in the Middle East. And I think that people are going to have to get used to sort of high fossil fuel prices and high diesel prices, and it's really interesting. If you look at that grey line down at the grey thing at the bottom, that's the diesel market. You can see it's kind of trending down there, but what actually happened in the last month actually plunged, and particularly with the utes, like the diesel utes just absolutely fell out of bed. in the last month because people just go, "Cross, I'm not going to pay that much for fuel." Orange is the petrol, that's been declining a while. Hybrids in Australia, we buy a lot of hybrids, partly because we've been conditioned to think that, okay, if you want to go green, don't go batteries because you'll be stuck in the middle of nowhere with nothing to charge and you'll be stuck. And there's just such a huge campaign against EVs in social media and even in mainstream media, which is very unfortunate. The counterpoint to that, of course, is actually having an EV and showing it and sharing it and driving people, and people just go, "Oh, that actually works. It's really nice to drive. It's quiet. It's reliable, and it's cheaper to run." And so that's good. And the green, of course, is the battery EV. Just having a look at the bottom line of the green. So it was pretty low. That was essentially just a Nissan Leaf that was being sold until Tesla turned up in 2019 with a Model 3, which gave that little bump. Then you had a bigger bump happening when the Model Y turned up. And then you get the other rise in about 2022, 23, when some of the Chinese car makers started to turn up to our shores for the first time. A lot of these car makers we've never actually heard of. I thought it was going to really take off then, but then people decided they didn't like Elon Musk because he turned out to be a bit of a dick, really. When it came around to Trump, and they seem to be over that now. They're now buying it, and then we just had this sort of shoot up after a while. So there you go. This is what's happened at the moment. What's the best-selling Tesla Model Y? So they've forgiven Elon, and everyone's coming in and buying Teslas again. It was the best-selling car of any sort in the month of May in Australia, and that was the first time an EV has been the best-selling model. That's pretty amazing. And it was chased down by the C-Line 7 and Geely and JQ and Zeekr. Now, how many people a couple of years ago would have heard of any of those names? Absolutely not. But they just sort of come out of nowhere, and people are really quite excited and impressed by those brands. Here's an interesting thing, though, that Tesla is no longer the biggest EV brand. So BYD actually sells a lot more cars than that, but some of them are hybrids, including the plug-in hybrids, such as the BYD Shark, which has been really, very popular, and a couple of people here have them. But they've overtaken Tesla in gross sales. That's because they've got about 6 or 7 EVs on the market, and Tesla still just has 2, because we will probably never see the Cybertruck. Because it just looks like a war machine, and enough people still think Elon's a dick. And you've got, the other interesting thing about that is you've got some other traditional car makers like Kia and Hyundai and Volkswagen who make the top 10. Toyota, who is the biggest car maker of any in Australia, is, what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 to the bottom there in
He's coming.
Press harder. Rex to the rest.
Don't let Rex take it. Just got a few more slides to go. Okay, where are we heading? I put a picture of the Toyota electric ute here for a reason. One is that Toyota has been probably the biggest opponent of the transition to electric vehicles in Australia. It has kind of led the big pushback by the Japanese car makers against all the policies that could support EVs in Australia. And it has finally decided to release an electric Hilux. Hilux has been with the Ford range the best-selling car of any sort in Australia for the last couple of years. The first model is pretty pathetic because it's only got a range of about 200 kilometres, but I hope people buy it. But hopefully they just come out with a longer range and just do the right thing and just show that you just wonder with Toyota, why don't you just come out with an electric Camry or an electric Yaris and they will just sell its socks off. And if you actually look at some of the European markets, there's a whole bunch. Toyota is number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5 in electric vehicle sales in those ones, particularly Norway, which is now at a 98% share of EVs of new car sales. And there's Toyota EVs there that we've never heard of because they haven't bothered to bring them here. They tell us, they tell our government and they tell our media that, oh no, we can't do electric cars, but they can because they're doing them already in Europe. But now, because we've got at least some policies in here, such as the new vehicle emission standards, which are pretty lightweight, they probably should be stronger, but look, there's something. They've kind of realised that, oh, okay, we're going to do this. So the utes are going to be really interesting because they are the biggest part of Australia's new car market. Their sales have plunged. So Ford Ranger and Toyota Hilux came down a lot in the last couple of months because of the diesel cost. There's a hesitation. I guess those people just haven't bought anything because there's not much to offer them in terms of electric utes. There's something called the Musso, there's the Shark, which is a plug-in hybrid, and there's another one, I can't remember who made it now, but it wasn't very good. But hopefully now we can start to see more electric utes roll out, which are good, which are sturdy, got vehicle to load, vehicle to grid, and have a longer range and a few spare tyres. So we'll see what happens. Yeah, because as we discovered when we drove up from Sydney to Brisbane, Sydney to Byron Bay, where we live, a couple of weeks ago, we finally got a puncture out and we'll move, and we had to sit there and wait a while for a tyre to come in. So but that's another story. Where does Australia sit in the world of EVs? Well, thanks to the last month, we kind of jumped up to about 20%. So just sort of in between Netherlands and Iceland, which is probably a nice place to be. Somewhere around Costa Rica and Uruguay. Look at Norway, it's 97, 98%. I think they sold 16 petrol cars last month. And as I say, it's sort of Toyota and VW lead the way there. So overseas, it's happening sort of quite quickly. Most European markets are now in the 20s and the 30s. We've got Sweden down there is quite low, but I think that must be wrong. Denmark is also really high. And what's really interesting is some of the third world countries too, Nepal, Ethiopia, their shares are actually higher than that. So this was actually something that was done for 2025. If you see the results for May, and I couldn't quite get hold of them sort of globally, but some of their EV market shares are really quite stunning. And that's pretty exciting. US, you see, is stuck on 10%. Basically, the only thing that's selling over there is Tesla, because Ford and GM decided to go into EVs, and they said, well, we just can't compete with the Chinese, and the only thing protecting their market there is that the Chinese aren't allowed to, they're basically excluded from the market. So, they've almost given up and written off 25, $30 billion each on it, so pretty poor effort. And there's China, biggest car market in the world, 50%. Co-host of my podcast, David Leach, is travelling around China at the moment, and he just goes, it's just amazing the number of electric vehicles there, electric trucks, electric buses, just electric everything. It's extraordinary. And one more slide. I put this in because there's always a big debate about, okay, well, how dirty is EVs? And look, if you live in a coal-fired power state like Queensland, I'm sorry to say that, but Queensland is still the most heavily coal-dependent state in the country, although that is changing thanks to all the people with households with rooftop solar, and there's some wind and solar farms still being built by the new government. But even if you charge an EV from the grid, even if it's a dirty grid, it's still a cleaner option than if you're driving it with petrol and diesel. And this kind of shows some of the dirtiest places like China and India and Indonesia, which got dominated by coal-fired generation, and pretty lousy coal-fired generation, pretty dirty stuff. If you drive electric vehicles, you're still using a lot less fossil fuels. And the reason for that is the efficiency of electric vehicos. If you think about sort of fossil fuel engines, you couldn't actually imagine anything less efficient, because just so much of it is wasted in heat and it just disappears. That's true of coal-fired power stations, about 2/3. In petrol cars, diesel cars, about 3/4 of the actual energy which is created just disappears as heat and is not useful energy. So when Anne talks about electrification and I talk about electric vehicles, we're talking about a more efficient world, a world that uses a lot less energy than before. You hear people say, oh yeah, but wind and solar only account for 2 or 3% or 5% or 10%, whatever the number is of final energy. It's done nothing despite all the millions and the billions being spent on it. But on the useful energy, its share is actually already significant, and it is growing very quickly. So there you go. And that is really quick. Now, where are we going? Just quite a question. I was supposed to talk on this, but I'm only going to talk about it in the last minute. Where are we going? I think that now that we've got critical mass, I think there's enough people out there with a 20% market share. I'd be really interested in hearing what Dean says about this. We've got enough people out there with electric cars, with their friends, with their neighbours. They're talking to them. People can explain how good they are. They can take them for a ride. They can let them drive it, and they go, "Oh, this is actually really, really good. I can actually drive to my holiday place and get back again." There's not just a couple of thousand charging points. There's everywhere where there's a plug in Australia. We've got electricity most of it. There's a place to charge your EVs, and they're getting cheaper and cheaper and a lot less expensive to run. So look forward to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you.